All right. Welcome to week 2 review for APES. Today I'll be covering the 4 important biogeochemical cycles that are found in Unit 1. So this review will basically answer the question, what happens to matter in an ecosystem? So a little bit of background information from last week. An ecosystem is a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. And one more key piece of information that'll make a lot of this a little easier to understand is something that you might have learned in biology, physics, or physical science, which is the law of conservation of mass. So mass or matter it's not created or destroyed by chemical reactions or physical transformations. It just changes. So all of the matter in an ecosystem will be there. It will just change forms and it will move around. That's essentially a biogeochemical cycle. So for each cycle, I'm going to be kind of covering 3 main ideas, and I'll also be giving you some hints as to what College Board may be asking you about each biogeochemical cycle on the exam. So the first concept here is that life is sustained by cycling of nutrients within the biosphere. So questions will be, what nutrients in particular, why are they needed by living organisms? The second concept, some organisms produce the nutrients they need, others consume other organisms to obtain the nutrients, and then still some recycle nutrients back to the producers. So questions will be focused on what are the individual processes within each cycle, and then how are organisms involved with the processes, and what are they actually doing? Which organisms perform them? And then the last thing, human activities are altering the flow of nutrients within ecosystems and the biosphere. So you will need to know what particular human activities are occurring within each cycle, and then how does that change those aspects of the cycle and then their outcomes. So there are a few things that all of the biogeochemical cycles have in common. One, there are short-term and there are long-term storage within each cycle. Short-term storage is things in when you're getting things stored for maybe months or a few years. That's going to be in like living things. Storage in sediments at the bottom of the ocean, that would be a long term, and we're talking over the period of hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years. There are also biological processes and physical processes in every single cycle. So for instance, photosynthesis is a biological process. An organism is doing something with the matter in that cycle. But then you also have physical processes like erosion, which is caused by water and wind. There are terrestrial and aquatic locations for a lot of the things within each cycle, and most also have an atmospheric component. So many of the nutrients we'll talk about, like nitrates and phosphates, are found in rocks on land, but then they can also be dissolved in water in aquatic systems. And then again, most cycles have some kind of gaseous component like carbon dioxide or oxygen gas. So let's jump into the first cycle, which is the carbon cycle. There is a lot going on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start up here with atmospheric carbon dioxide, and then we're going to follow it through the cycle and through all of the different processes. So first, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can be fixed in a form that organisms can use by photosynthesis here. So carbon dioxide is taken out of the air and incorporated into producers like plants, algae, anything that can do photosynthesis, in order for consumers to have access to those carbon molecules. So both producers here, okay, and animals, consumers, as well as bacteria, are all going to be using organic molecules as energy sources. And in doing so, they will re-release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So you've kind of got this exchange of carbon dioxide between photosynthesis and respiration. And if you notice, there isn't really a gain of carbon dioxide either way. And I'll kind of cover that in a little bit because it's a really important aspect of the carbon cycle to remember. So what are some other natural pathways? So some of this carbon in the soil that are being consumed by bacteria, some of it can actually become compacted over time, right? It can be incorporated into soil sediments over time, and then layers and layers and layers compact those underneath. Over really, really long term, like long amount of time, those carbon molecules can be formed into fossil fuels. So that includes things like petroleum, coal, and also natural gas. That is a long-term aspect of this cycle. Now, back to the atmosphere here, another natural pathway would be carbon dioxide diffusing between the atmosphere and water. And this happens at the surface, depending on how much carbon dioxide is actually within the water at any given time. Now, this carbon dioxide then can become a part of marine food chains, just like it did on the land with terrestrial food chains. And then long term, as those producers and consumers die in the ocean, they will float down to the bottom and they will become incorporated into layers of sediment on the ocean floor. Now, over time, that is going to compact again into things like limestone, okay? And that carbon will not be released back into the atmosphere or the soil until those sediments themselves are exposed again, maybe again thousands or millions of years in the future. Now, those are all natural processes, but there are some pathways that are particularly affected by humans, and those are going to be those in red. So, of course, the most impactful thing that we do is burning of fossil fuels. So remember, this right here, this was a long-term storage. So this is carbon that has been in the ground for a really, really long time and has not been in the atmosphere, being exchanged by, plants and other consumers. So once we dig these up and expose them and then burn them, we are adding a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that had been stored for a really long time. Other things that we do is affect the producer level of ecosystems by either deforestation or even things like slash and burn agriculture or other types of forest fires. Well, that takes the carbon that was stored in the plant producer level and releases it back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Okay, moving on to photosynthesis and respiration, because this is one of the kind of stumbling points that can occur during a free response question when you're being asked how does human activities affect the carbon cycle. And a lot of times you'll think, well, we have cellular respiration. We let out carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Well, that's a human impact. So that's not necessarily what they're asking you for, because cellular respiration is typically in balance with photosynthesis. So let's really break down this process. So of course, we've got carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water from the root system, the soil, precipitation, that is then incorporated into glucose and oxygen using the energy from the sun. And specialized organelles like chloroplasts. This can also happen in bacteria. It just really depends on the location within the cell. So for a consumer, or really even for the plant themselves, so don't forget that producers also must do cellular respiration. All living things do. So for animals, plants, bacteria, whatever, they are going to use the organic molecules, the carbon organic compounds. They're going to use that for energy, and by doing that, it's pretty much like combustion. You're going to end up with carbon dioxide as a waste product as well as water. And so this is just going to continue in a cycle over and over again. Cellular respiration could not have occurred had there not been carbon fixed within an organic molecule in the first place. Right? So the thing to remember about respiration is that it can't contribute to things like climate change or air pollution or anything like that, because the carbon exchange between producers and consumers are roughly equivalent between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. All right. Let's kind of wrap up the carbon cycle with our 3 concepts. So 1, life is sustained by cycling of nutrients within the biosphere. So what we need to know about that is that carbon is needed for organic molecules, usually in the form of, molecules for energy like glucose or other sugars, but it's also the backbone for pretty much all organic life. Some organisms produce nutrients, others consume, and then yet others recycle. So remember that producers fix carbon through photosynthesis, and then everything else, consumers, the plants themselves, decomposers that live off of dead and decaying things, all of those things are going to release that same carbon back into the atmosphere from respiration. And then the human activities that are altering this biogeochemical cycle. Pretty much all the time, the burning of fossil fuels is going to be a great answer for this. Other things that we can do that contribute to more CO2 in the atmosphere or other carbon molecules in the atmosphere are things like the raising of livestock, so methane emissions from cattle, or deforestation, which burns the trees, and it reduces the ability of the producers to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. All right, so let's kind of move on to the phosphorus cycle. Again, you've got pathways here that are natural. They just occur within nature. And then you've got pathways that are affected by humans. Here's another thing that we're going to really focus on when it comes to phosphorus and also nitrogen are the reservoirs. So where is it that phosphorus, nitrogen, carbon, water, where is it stored, either long-term or short-term? So speaking of time, this is actually the slowest cycle, meaning that the transition of phosphorus throughout the cycle, it happens slowly. It's also a really huge limiting factor to plant growth. And one of the reasons for that is because it is so slow. It takes a long time for phosphorus to cycle through. So let's start with phosphorus in sediments here. So let's start with deep ocean sediments of phosphate, okay, which is an ion that's got phosphorus in it. Over time and through geological processes, some of this ocean bed is going to be exposed and eventually become what is terrestrial phosphate deposits like rock, or the things like fossil bones. And over time, through water hitting the surface, wind, just the general breaking up of the ground, that phosphate is going to erode and run off into water. Okay. Then some of that phosphate can now be incorporated into the producers through assimilation. The things that are eating the producers, the consumers, that's how they get their phosphate. And then bacteria or other decomposers get the phosphate from dead and decaying plants and animals. So because phosphate is a limiting factor for plant growth, it is one of the main components of industrialized fertilizer. So we want our crops and we want our plants to grow fast. We want them to produce a lot of biomass for us to be able to eat. Or maybe we just want them to have a lot of flowers or whatever we want. So oftentimes we are mining for phosphates in the ground in order to extract and condense down into fertilizers that can be sold. So one of the main problems with this is that once you expose the ground here, you can't collect 100% of the phosphates here. So anytime you've got a mining operation, there will be waste. And water will always take some of that phosphate waste and it will run off through erosion into other bodies of water. Now, this would be an unintentional dumping of phosphate into a water resource. This can cause other things to have a population explosion in the lake, and that can really disrupt the ecosystem from its balance, right? Other things that we do that are sort of affected by humans, so we're affecting this pathway here, is also fertilizer and agricultural waste, contamination of water resources. So if you have a large crop here and you put a bunch of phosphate on it, not 100% of that phosphate will be absorbed by the plants, and some of it will eventually run off down into the watershed. Also, if you have any kind of like animal feeding lot operation, so you've got a lot of animals in a small space, they're eating, they're producing waste, and that waste has to be contained in some place, and it's usually on site. So sometimes phosphates in actual animal waste, and even sometimes human waste, can run off into these same places here in the watershed. So reviewing of the phosphorus cycle, some big concepts here. Why do we need phosphorus? Life is sustained by cycling of nutrients, but why do living things even need it? Well, phosphorus is important for biomolecules like nucleic acids, so DNA and RNA. They're also part of all cell membranes, and they are part of ATP, right? So sort of the energy currency of life. Very important macronutrient. So some organisms, produce nutrients they need, others don't. So the producers in the phosphorus cycle are going to be the ones that are assimilating phosphorus from the cycle, and then that allows all the other consumers to get their phosphorus. Major human activities that are altering the flow of nutrients are going to be our mining, and then our runoff of fertilizer, so as a waste, animal and human waste, and all of those things potentially pollute water sources and can cause those population booms that I was talking about of algae, right? Making the pond like really green, and that causes something called cultural eutrophication, and you'll talk more about that in the water pollution unit. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle. This one's similar to phosphorus because it's also a limiting factor for producer growth. So we tend to use it in our industrial fertilizers, and it's really important for things like agriculture. But there are other ways that humans are influencing the nitrogen cycle. So we're going to start here with nitrogen in the atmosphere, kind of like we did with the carbon cycle. And I'm doing that because nitrogen's largest reservoir is in the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. So the way that nitrogen is incorporated into the biosphere, into all of the living things, is mostly going to be from chemical processes or metabolic processes by bacteria. So when you think of the nitrogen cycle, I want you to think about bacteria. They are really running the cycle, and without them, we would not have nitrogen available for plant growth and food and all those other things. So the way that nitrogen is fixed into a form that plants and consumers can use is through nitrogen fixation by bacteria. So nitrogen is taken up from the atmosphere, and it is fixed by things in the soil or also in like the root nodules of some plants that the bacteria are living there symbiotically. So you end up with a lot of nitrate in the soil. Now, some bacteria are also involved with making ammonia and re-releasing nitrogen into the atmosphere, but we'll get into that in just a little bit. So once nitrogen gas is fixed into a form that plants can use, then it can be assimilated. And then, of course, consumers will get their nitrates and other compounds from the plants. And then when they die and decompose, then it's converted back into the soil by decomposers. So soil is a large reservoir for nitrogen as well. So what happens with human interruptions with this cycle is mostly, again, mining nitrates for fertilizer and then adding them in huge concentrations to agriculture or fields for growing plants. So again, as precipitation hits the dirt here, all of that nitrogen is eventually going to run off into bodies of water, ocean, streams, watersheds. So some of this nitrogen is being used by the plants, but a lot of it is also contributing to that eutrophication that was happening with the phosphorus. Now, unlike phosphorus, that does not have an atmospheric component, nitrogen does. So as nitrogen exists in the atmosphere, it's pretty inert. You need to have some kind of like bacterial thing happen to convert it into a useful form. But when we burn fossil fuels, or if we are having inorganic fertilizers interact with the soil and atmosphere, we actually create different types of nitrogen compounds that are air pollutants, and we call these nitrogen dioxides. This is one of the more important air pollutants that you will talk about in the air pollution unit. So it contributes to things like photochemical smog. It can cause acid rain, which is really terrible for plant growth. So I want to take a close-up look of the nitrogen cycle, because this is one of the biogeochemical cycles that College Board will ask questions about in detail, as far as what are the metabolic processes that are happening to convert nitrogen in different forms. So I really want to zoom in on that. So let's again start here with atmospheric nitrogen N2. Like I said before, this nitrogen is converted into a form that living things can actually use by nitrogen fixing bacteria. And we usually say that they're sort of in the root nodules of some plants. Soybeans are really great for this, so that's why a lot of times farmers will plant soybeans and then another like nitrogen demanding crop like corn right after, and they'll kind of like rotate those out. So the plants here assimilate the nitrogen that way, and then again, consumers can eat it. Now, there's also nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil that undergo ammonification, and that converts nitrogen into ammonium ions. And then still further, you've got other bacterial species that are nitrifying bacteria that do nitrification, that creates nitrites, which can be converted by other nitrifying bacteria into nitrates, and those can then be assimilated into plants as well. Now, once you have nitrates in the soil, there is a way for it to be converted back into atmospheric nitrogen. That would be from denitrifying bacteria, this pathway here. And then anything that's trapped, that's a nitrogen compound that's trapped in plants and animals, can be returned back to the soil by decomposers, right? But the main take-home message here is that the nitrogen cycle would not work without bacteria. So soil bacteria is really important for plant growth and agriculture. So you'll also talk a lot about that when we talk about land use. All right, let's review. So why do we even need nitrogen? Life is sustained by cycling of nutrients, but why do we need this particular one? Well, nitrogen is a big part of nucleic acids like DNA, RNA again, and then also things like proteins. Don't forget that, bacteria are sort of the most important organisms when it comes to the nitrogen cycle. They're involved in most of the processes that allow producers and consumers to assimilate nitrogen. And then the human activities that are important here with altering the flow of nutrients are going to be nitrogen oxides from fuel combustion. Those form both primary and secondary air pollutants. And then you've got nitrate runoff from agricultural sources that are going to pollute watersheds, oceans, any kind of body of water. All right, the last one. So the water cycle it's kind of its own thing. It's the hydrologic cycle. But if you've noticed, it's also had it's been incorporated really in all of the other cycles, because you can't really have, runoff unless you have precipitation, and those are all processes involved with the water cycle. So it's very much all incorporated together. So let's talk about the natural processes first. So the easiest, of course, is going to be rain, right? Precipitation. That's how water gets to the land. That's, what we use to grow our crops and all kinds of things. So there are several ways that water ends up in the atmosphere to begin with, to even become precipitation. And one of these is from transpiration from plants. So if you remember from bio, in order for a plant to get the carbon dioxide that it needs from the atmosphere, it has to open up these little pores in its leaves to take in the gas. And whenever it does that, some of the water within the plant itself is going to escape. So transpiration from plants is actually a big contributor to atmospheric water vapor. The other process is going to be just evaporation, and that's driven by the sun, wind, temperature changes. Water is going to just escape from the land as water vapor here. This also can happen from the ocean and other bodies of water. So once you get enough water vapor here and you've got some condensation nuclei like dust, then you have rainfall happen, precipitation. Some of that precipitation is going to run into bodies of water, runoff. Some of that precipitation will then infiltrate the ground and percolate down through the layers of soil and bedrock and become trapped as groundwater in aquifers. So this is a huge natural reservoir of water, and one that is constantly exploited by human activity. And I'll get to that in just a second. So the other big natural reservoir here is also going to be an ice and snow. So there is a lot of water that is still trapped in ice caps and glaciers, and a lot of ecosystems rely on periodic snowmelt to provide enough water for the ecosystem to run. So what is it that humans are doing with the water cycle that's affecting water's ability to flow through all of these different points? So one of the things that we do is make impermeable surfaces. So here you can see this highway is, made out of cement, concrete, asphalt. Those don't allow water to penetrate through to get down to the ground. And so that water then just runs off, right? So it can run down to a sewer drain, it can run out into the watershed, but it's definitely not infiltrating the ground here. So what this does is it sort of deprives aquifers of that natural recharge. And so if then you're also pumping water out of the aquifer, right? So you're pumping it out, using it for irrigation, drinking water, whatever it is that we're doing. And then you're also paving over surfaces and not allowing water to go in. That's when we get into aquifer depletion. And there are some other land issues associated with it as well. So another thing that we do that affects the carbon cycle as well is deforestation. So when we take a section of forested land and we completely clear cut it, meaning we take down every single bit of trees, then it's going to increase the rate of water runoff, right? So then you get these other secondary issues like erosion of soil, increased landslides, pollution of the watershed by sediments, all kinds of things like that. And then of course, lastly, we have just good old basic water pollution, nitrate runoff, phosphate runoff, any kind of thing, dumping chemicals into bodies of water. Those are all things that humans are doing to sort of change the way the water cycle works. So let's review the concepts with the water cycle. Life is sustained by cycling of nutrients. Well, water isn't really a nutrient, but without water, pretty much all metabolic processes would not be possible. Ecosystem services like filtration and growth of plants and all those types of things would not happen. And also there would be less temperature regulation by bodies of water. Water resists temperature changes really well, and so water can help to cool things off or keep things warm when need be. So precipitation and evaporation rates are going to be one of the more important things for determining which organisms are able to grow, where they are, the distribution. So the precipitation and evaporation rates determine a lot about ecosystems. And then human activities, things that we're doing that are really big. Basically, we increase runoff and we decrease infiltration whenever we have a surface being put down that's impermeable. So you pour concrete for a parking lot. We build a house that has a slab underneath it. And then, of course, deforestation affects things like runoff and transpiration because there's no more trees. All right, so we are going to get into some actual questions to sort of practice with this content. The first question, elements that cycle in the environment and that also have a gaseous phase at some point in their cycle include which of the following? So let's talk about carbon. Carbon definitely cycles through the environment, and we know that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the gaseous phase here. And there's also things like methane, carbon monoxide, other stuff. But what about phosphorus? Phosphorus doesn't really have any type of atmospheric component. It's usually in rocks, soil, water, or living things. So no gaseous phase. Water definitely has a gaseous phase because water vapor, that's what clouds are. So the correct answer here would be D, which is carbon and water. Question 2. Which of the following best helps explain why phosphorus is often a limiting factor in many ecosystems? So there's usually a gaseous phase in the phosphorus cycle. We can go ahead and eliminate that one. Phosphorus cycles very quickly through environments. Well, it's actually the one that's the slowest, and it's mostly because there's no gaseous phase, so it relies on things like erosion and dissolving of sediments to get the phosphate out of the reservoirs. So that's probably not it. Under many conditions, phosphorus forms stable and soluble compounds. Well, that sounds right. You get phosphate salts trapped in rocks, but let's make sure that we eliminate all the options. D, phosphate is not readily taken up by plants. Well, that's definitely not true. So the correct answer here is C. Phosphorus really does easily form these stable compounds, and so it makes it very difficult to get them back into a form that plants can use. So question 3, we've got 5 different things here: nitrogen gas, oxygen gas, water, phosphate, and then methane. So which is a gas that is produced by raising cattle? So I mentioned that briefly when we talked about the carbon cycle. One of the byproducts of like the sort of digestive processes of cattle is using other bacteria to sort of digest the cellulose out of their food, and methane is a byproduct of that. So that is a greenhouse gas produced by those types of like animal operations. So which can be stored in marine sediments for long periods of time. So not nitrogen gas, because that's in the atmosphere, definitely not oxygen. Water isn't in a sediment. So really the only thing left here is going to be phosphate. So a greenhouse gas emitted into the atmosphere through transpiration and evaporation. Now that's kind of interesting because now we think, oh, that's definitely got to be water. But there's something here that's a little interesting about it. It's also calling it a greenhouse gas. Well, water vapor is actually a really great greenhouse gas, but it's not something that is contributing to climate change because, again, water is sort of always in like an equilibrium between the atmosphere and other forms. So that is C. So a limiting factor for most plant growth in lakes and terrestrial systems, definitely going to be phosphate. We can't pick nitrogen gas because remember, this has to actually be fixed into a form before it can be used by plants. So that would not be a limiting factor. Question 4. What is the end product of the wood in a log being decomposed by fungi. So let's make sure that we're really thinking about this word here. I mean, this is just another way of saying, respiration by fungi. So we know from that talk about photosynthesis and respiration, the byproducts of that are going to be carbon dioxide as a gas, and then also water. Now, that does not mean that there isn't going to be, heat energy that is also sort of lost, but we're talking about the matter here. So what is going to be the end matter products after decomposition? Question 5. The pictures above show an area that was once an open field that has been developed into a suburban neighborhood. Which of the following changes in the hydrologic cycle is most likely to occur as a result of the change in the area? So let's kind of take a minute to talk about what's going on here. So here we've got like an open field. There's some grass, there are some trees here, but pretty much if any water hits the surface of this field, a good bit of it is going to be able to infiltrate into the ground and then percolate down through the layers. But if we look here, we still have some grass, we still got a little bit of trees, but a good area or a good part of that area has now been paved over. So if there's going to be precipitation, it's likely going to just increase in runoff through this gutter system. So did we increase transpiration? I don't think so. We kind of cut down some more trees. We probably decreased it. Did we decrease the runoff? Again, probably not. It's probably worse because now, the water can't get through this asphalt. Did we increase precipitation? I mean, probably not. A change like this, a local change like this, isn't really going to change precipitation rates. But it is true that we decreased infiltration, and we did that by creating this impermeable surface here. Question 6. In the nitrogen cycle illustrated to the right, nitrogen fixation occurs in which of the following steps? So nitrogen gas is being converted to organic nitrogen, and then ammonium, and then to nitrites and nitrates, and then back again to nitrogen gas. So this step right here, step 1, converting nitrogen to a form that plants and animals can use, that is going to be nitrogen fixation, fixing it into something that a plant can assimilate. Here is, again, ammonification. This would be nitrification by nitrifying bacteria. And this is denitrification, again, by some bacteria, back into nitrogen gas. Okay, so I do have a free response question here. This one is really good because it covers a lot of aspects of what we just talked about with biogeochemical cycles, and it's also a good review of what the what College Board wants you to do with the information, so those task verbs. So we know biogeochemical cycles describe the movement of certain elements through Earth's atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and lithosphere. These elements and their compounds are necessary components of all life, and because they cycle, they can be used repeatedly by new generations of organisms. Each biogeochemical cycle has different pathways with various reservoirs where elements may reside for days or millions of years. So here they're giving us a little bit of new information by saying reservoirs just mean sources and sinks. That'll come up later. So part A, the atmosphere is one important carbon reservoir. They want you to describe a biological process by which carbon is removed from the atmosphere and converted to organic molecules, and then describe a biological process by which carbon is converted from organic molecules to a gas and returned to the atmosphere. So before we look at possible answers here, let's remember what they mean by describe. This is a task verb. What they want you to do is to provide relevant characteristics of a specified topic. So I'm sure we can go ahead and identify what they want us to do here. So like taking carbon and converting it to organic molecules, oh, that's for sure photosynthesis, right? That's identifying the process. And in 2, well, this is respiration. But that's not enough. We have to actually describe it. And we can't just say, well, respiration, it converts organic molecules to a gas and returns it to the atmosphere. We have to give more details. So let's look at the first part here. Describe a biological process with carbon being removed from the atmosphere and converted to organic stuff. So you cannot just name photosynthesis here, right? That would be identifying. You have to describe it. So the example they give you is photosynthesis is the process by which plants or autotrophs take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then convert it to food, glucose, sugar, carbohydrates, however you wanted to do it. You could even say fix carbon into those compounds as well. That would give you a point. So notice they say, carbon removed from the atmosphere and then to organic compounds. So you have to say, well, it's carbon dioxide, and here are the compounds it's being converted to. With part 2, you had to do this basically for respiration. So again, you can't just list a word as an answer, and you also had to identify the form of carbon being released into the atmosphere. When College Board wants you to describe, they really do want you to show what you know about a certain topic. So you could have said, respiration is going to break down whatever you said in part 1 there, and then that releases CO2 into the atmosphere. You could have also talked about digestion of food. This goes back to the raising of cattle and releasing methane, which is also part of the carbon cycle. You also could have talked about decomposition by bacteria and fungi, and that's going to produce CO2 or even methane as a byproduct. All right, part B. Oceans and terrestrial systems are also important carbon reservoirs. So they want you now to explain how atmospheric carbon is incorporated into 2 oceanic sinks. And they told you what a sink was. It's basically a reservoir. And then they want you to identify a terrestrial sink other than fossil fuels that stores carbon in the long term for thousands to millions of years. So again, before I show you the answers, let's talk about those task verbs. Identify. Indicate or provide information about a specified topic without elaboration or explanation. You're just literally naming something. But explain is providing information about how or why a relationship or a process or something is happening or occurring using some kind of evidence and reasoning to support your claim or the question here, which is how atmospheric carbon is being incorporated into the sinks. So let's look at part 1. You got 2 points for this. 1 point for describing how carbon is incorporated into the sink, and you only had the first 2 that you wrote about be able to be graded. So you got to be also pretty save your space. Only talk about the ones they want you to do, which is 2 here. So you could have said that carbon dioxide, carbon can be taken up by organisms like phytoplankton for photosynthesis. It also can be incorporated into marine organisms and used for shells, skeletons, or reef building, coral reef building. We also discussed how organisms that have incorporated carbon, once they are, if they're in the ocean, once they die, they are going to sink from the top layers of the ocean to the bottom and then become incorporated into sediment. We also discussed how CO2 can just dissolve directly into the water, and then that CO2 can dissolve back into the atmosphere, and it can also be dissolved in other water sources like precipitation. Also, carbon can react with other elements and form parts of rocks like carbonates, limestone, or sedimentary rock. I want you to really notice a point here about this. So you could not just say carbon can be put in rocks, because at this point in environmental science, they want you to understand specifically what type of rocks. So, saying sedimentary rocks, that's always a good way to go. Part 2, old growth forest or forests that live for thousands of years would have been appropriate. And the reason why you can't just say forest is because not all forests actually are around very long, but forests that have been around for thousands of years, that would be a long-term sink. It could be trapped in ice caps, glaciers, again, sedimentary rocks, soil, dissolved in aquifers, any of those things. What you definitely couldn't have said here, though, is the atmosphere. It definitely doesn't store carbon for thousands to millions of years. All right, still on to the carbon cycle, but now we're talking about the burning of fossil fuels has been shown to increase the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. Discuss 2 other human activities that increase concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. So a lot of times when I read student responses for free response questions, and it's kind of like this where they tell you like you can't discuss one of the things. Either the student is sort of like not necessarily paying attention to that part of the question or maybe forgets, but you would not get points here if you then started talking about the burning of fossil fuels. They want to know that you know about the carbon cycle, which means knowing more about the human activities involved with it than just burning fossil fuels. All right, what do they mean by discuss? Require an exploration of relationships between concepts or phenomena. That could include identifying, describing, and explaining to be a satisfactory discussion. So we talked about a lot of this in the carbon cycle. Not only do we burn fossil fuels, but we also cut down trees during deforestation, which would reduce the amount of carbon that could be taken up by those trees. And so that is also going to result in the stored carbon in those trees being released back to the atmosphere through burning, possibly burning the trees there. We also burn trash or we incinerate other waste that can release carbon. Slash and burn agricultural practices, which we'll get to in the land use unit. Basically, we're burning down parts of the forest to re-enrich the soil for agriculture, but that's going to release a lot of carbon as a byproduct. We can make landfills that produce carbon-based gases, mainly methane. We're going back to the agricultural aspect of animal husbandry. You know, cows and other type of ruminant animals release methane a lot. And then there's several other examples here. But the point is, I would definitely know of at least, you know, a couple of other things that humans are doing in the carbon cycle other than burning fossil fuels. All right, last little bit here, talking about phosphorus. It's an element important to all organisms. Describe one major way in which the phosphorus cycle differs from the carbon cycle, and then identify one reason that phosphorus is necessary for organisms. So we know what those task verbs want us to do. What are the points? So phosphorus doesn't typically have a gas or atmospheric phase. There's not like a phosphorus gas that's, you know, in the atmosphere. That's a big difference between it and the carbon cycle. It's also, again, more difficult for organisms to access phosphorus because remember, the main reason or the main way that we get phosphate is through the weathering of rocks and erosion, and that's so much slower than simply taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then converting it into organic molecules. And then part 2, you know, many reasons why phosphorus is necessary for organisms. It was in our review of the phosphorus cycle. It's a component of nucleotides and ATP, nucleic acids. Here for DNA, RNA, they're also part of the cell membrane as phospholipids. And phosphorus is found in animal bones and the teeth of mammals. Okay, so that was the biogeochemical cycles. And I hope that helped everybody know the important topics that you'll have to know about them for APES.